Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to start with a new chapter concerning the American civilization. Today we're going to deal with a new lecture. Of course, this lecture is concerned with what happened after the independence, because if you have seen my previous videos, you are going to find them in my channel. Check them. And those videos were concerned only with the colonial period until the independence. 6 videos from the colonial period until the independence. Um, Today we are going to speak about what happened after the independence. After 1783, after the War of Independence, then after the creation of the American Constitution. This period is called the antebellum, and the lecture is the pre-Civil War, because after or in 1861 there was what we call the American Civil War. So this is the topic of the day, the pre-Civil War, and not the Civil War. It's what happened before the Civil War. So please leave a like if this video is beneficial to you. Subscribe to the channel, that would encourage me to do more. And I have a Facebook page of this channel. I'm gonna leave the link in the description below. Leave a like in order to be notified. And without further ado, I shall start. Alright, so the pre-Civil War, we should know, like I said, the period of the pre-Civil War is also called the antebellum. It is given the name of antebellum. It is given the name of the antebellum. Now we are going to speak about, first, let's make an outline about the lecture of today. We're going to speak about the pre-Civil War reforms, right? We're going to speak about the pre-Civil War culture. Then we're going to get a little bit in literature, which is beneficial, of course, to the students of English. Then we are going to speak about the differences between the North and the South, because United States at that time were divided into northern states and southern states. Then we're going to speak about the crisis and the spark of the American Civil War. So I shall just start with the pre-Civil War reform. So what is a reform? A reform is basically a change of something that is already broken or bad, something which is not appreciated by people. So they decide to make a reform of it in order to make a better version of it, of course. Now, we shall start. Why did the American government want to do this kind of reform? Of course, there was the criminal life in America at that time, or debauchery in general, and so the government decided to build prisons and even more public schools in order to eliminate illiteracy. They believed that illiteracy was the main cause of criminality in United States of America. So if they abolish it, things would be better to them. They wanted to eliminate criminal life or criminality in general. And also there was one more thing. Giving the right to women to vote was important to the American government as well. You need to know that women at that time did not have the right to vote in the United States of America. So people started considering it because it was quite important. It is written in their constitution, all men are born equal. You know? So they started thinking about making things better, and to do so they had to make some reforms. We are going to see what kind of reforms. So in terms of reform, we have 3 stages of reform. The first one is moral, which means they wanted to create a better social life. They wanted to make a better society. But this society, they wanted to make it mostly close to God. In other words, godly daily life. Sorry, so the purpose was always to eliminate criminal life. In order to do so, they had to spread new morals through public speeches, because at that time we did not have televisions, we did not have internet. So in order to spread these ideas, these enlightening ideas, they had to spread these morals through public speeches and religious tracts. And a religious tract is a card which is showed American people how to behave as good citizens and good people in general. This is about the moral reforms. The second stage is the social reforms. So, as cited before, as I said before, they aimed for the perfection of society by reinforcing laws through building more prisons and public schools, like I said in that general introduction. And in order to, or for them, according to them, getting less criminality. When you build prisons, you get less criminality because people are afraid to go to prison, and you get more intellectuals because you are building more public schools. And this was important for the American government, or it was even crucial to do so. Then the third stage, which is the most important one, it is the radical reforms. They wanted to end slavery and save black people. There is something called the Underground Railroad. Basically, it's like a code. It's like there were the southern colonies depended on agriculture, but it was not the white men who worked on the lands, but it was the black people who worked on the white men's lands. So the northern states, they were industrious. They didn't have agriculture, and it was let's say the north was more developed than the south. So they had more intellectuals, so they had enlightened ideas, so they understood that slavery is a bad thing, and also the American Constitution does not say that you have to be or you have to have slaves in order to succeed, to flourish, etc. So they wanted to make these radical reforms, and as they wanted to end gender discrimination. Like I said before, women would have more rights, just like the right to vote. This is in terms of the three stages of the reforms. Now we move to the pre-Civil War culture. Now we move a little bit to literature. We know that they had a poor culture in American, let's say the Americans in general. Why? Because there was a war, and there was what we call the complex of the colonized, which means they were imitating the British people. Because do not forget, the 13 colonies are British people, right, who got their independence from the crown. Still, they are imitating. They have the same writing style, and in general, they imitate the British culture in general. But then they developed a certain kind of consciousness which resulted in the American literature and art, etc. So they started to think that they should have their own things instead of imitating British people. So I'm going to cite some, or maybe four examples about the um, the things that show that they started to think about the American things rather than imitating British people. Let's say, some works that prove they were separated from British way of doing. We have Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, which was written in 1819. We have Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836, and Nathaniel Hawthorne in 1850, who wrote The Scarlet Letter, and Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. So, I advise you to read about Rip Van Winkle. Let's say a small novella maybe, or a short story. It's a great story to read, especially it's like when you're reading it, you imagine the life of the U.S. at that time. It's a great story to read. Sorry. So these four works show how the Americans started to diverge, or the departure of the Americans from the British way of writing or culture in general. Now we move to the North and the South, or let's say the differences between the North and the South. You should know that the North is more populated than the South, and the North attracted more settlers than the South as well. And even once more, the North is more urbanized than the South, because there was industry in the North, and In the South, we had agriculture. So the North was more urbanized, and the let's say opposite of the word urbanized is rural. So we say the South was rural and the North was urban. Then we have the North is industrial and the South is agricultural, which is obvious. And one more thing, the North, we call the North Yankee, and the South is called the Dixies. There's a song called the Dixieland as well, if you want to check it. And now we move to what we call the nullification crisis. From here and now, things started to go from, let's say, fragile to bad. There was a tension between the South and the North. First of all, we have the nullification crisis. It was a problem between the federal government of the United States and the state of South Carolina. What did they do? They imposed high tariffs on South Carolina, which was perceived as unconstitutional thing to do, right? So these tariffs were forced on South Carolina, and South Carolina was an agricultural state, so it was hard for them to pay these tariffs. So they perceived these, let's say, so-called tax as unconstitutional. So they refused to pay it, and the president of that time, Andrew Jackson, was given or was going to use military force to oblige them to pay. But there was no war, there was a compromise in 1833. You should know, you should bear in mind, you should understand that there were many compromises which avoided war. So the first compromise was not the first, but one of the compromises was in 1833, which dealt with the problem between South Carolina and the federal government of the United States upon the tariffs imposed on South Carolina. So this compromise, they reduced the tariff, so South Carolina was able to pay, so war was avoided. Then we have the impending crisis. The impending crisis, basically, it's something which was about to happen after the Missouri Compromise in March the 3rd, 1820. Slavery should be prohibited in the northern side of Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase. So Louisiana was held by French people. So the French knew that they are going to lose it. They're going to lose Louisiana. Why? Because the Americans at that time, they were working according to a principle called the Manifest Destiny or the frontier. Do not confuse the word frontier with boundaries. It's not the same thing. Um, so the frontier means to expand westwards or to go from the east to the west and taking the lands to the Americans, annexing the lands. So what did the French and more or especially Napoleon Bonaparte? He decided to sell. He decided to sell that land to the Americans in order to get some money to finance the war against England, uh, rather than losing it anyways, because he knew that he won't be able to keep Louisiana. So that was called the Louisiana Purchase. So they said, or the government said, that slavery should be prohibited in the north side of Louisiana and Maine. So in this Missouri Compromise, we had dealt with three things. First one is slavery should be prohibited in the northern side of Louisiana. The second thing is Maine, which is a state in the United States of America. Maine should be admitted to the Union as a free state, means no slaves in Maine, and Missouri as a slave state. So here we can notice that if we give a free state to the north, we give a slave state to the south. Otherwise, we won't keep balance and things could go wrong. So once again, war was avoided. Then after the Mexican War, right after the Mexican War from 1846 until 1848, the North and the South wanted to, or let's say the North wanted the annexed territories. When there was a war against Mexico, some let's say some states were taken from Mexico, such as Nevada, Texas, New Mexico. All these states were taken from Texas during the War of 1846 until 1848. So when you have new lands, the North wants these lands because they're rich, and the South wants these lands as well because they're rich. So there was another compromise. It is called the Compromise of 1850. And they dealt with the fact that Southwest goes to the southern states and California is a free state in the Union. So California, we won't find slaves there, and the Southwest goes to the southern states in which we find slaves. So then this is the conflict. We have a conflict which is quite important. It happened in May 13th, 1854. This conflict was called Kansas and Nebraska conflict. This conflict was between the North and the South, of course. So the Congress responded with Kansas and Nebraska Act in May 13th, 1854. What is this act about? It consists of letting people to vote whether to have a free or slave state. So they had these new states. They wanted to admit them to the Union, but they did not know whether to take them as free or slave states. So what did the Congress do? The Congress responded to give the right to the people of Nebraska and Kansas to vote whether they want to live in a free state. For example, the people who lived in Nebraska, they would vote whether they want Nebraska to be a free or a slave state, and the same thing with Kansas. So we have a vote, and who says vote? We says campaigns. So during the campaigns, in order to convince people whether to vote for slave or to vote for a free state, there was a conflict and there was violence between the supporters of freedom and slavery. Then in 1857, the Dred Scott decision. This is quite important. The U.S. Supreme Court said that the blacks are not equal with the whites, so they are not included in the American Constitution, which enforced the conflict between these two supporters. So we are giving the right to those who supported slaves to carry on with slavery, and the North does not want slavery. So in 16 until 18 October 1859, there was a man called John Brown. He was a white who was also against slavery. He wanted to give weapons, to give arms to blacks. Then he did so, and they attacked a fortress. This fortress named Harper's Ferry. Then the U.S. Marine, Lieutenant Israel Green, took back the fortress and captured John Brown. Later on, he was executed along with the men who followed him. Then we move, that was the end of, let's say, this summary of the pre-Civil War period. Then we have the Civil War. How did it start? Next time I'm going to start with Abraham Lincoln. How was he elected? I'm going to give a small biography about him. Then I shall carry on with the American Civil War. So next time we are going to speak or to start from Abraham Lincoln until 1865. Sorry. So if this was beneficial, please leave a like, subscribe once more, and like the Facebook page as well. And if you have any question, you can always message the Facebook page and I'll answer as soon as I see your message. So I tell you, see you in the next video. Peace.